I think there may be some confusion about the seating. There is no confusion, only the truth you've been hiding from. Sit down. There is something you should have been told 3 years ago, and I am done being the reason you weren't.
The voice memo came in at 3:58 in the morning, on a number Co Jun-ho didn't recognize, sent to a phone he kept for exactly 9 contacts and no one else. It played for 38 seconds. It said only one sentence, in unhurried English, in a voice he hadn't heard in 3 years, and it ended with a breath that told him more than the words did. The breath of a woman who had stopped needing him to understand anything. Let me ask you something before this story really starts. Have you ever built your entire sense of who you are around one decision, only to find out, years later, that the decision was never really yours to make, that the ground under it was fake the whole time, and you were the only person standing on it who didn't know? That's where this story begins. Not with a wedding, not with a bride in an imported gown, but with a man standing in his own bathroom at 4 in the morning, staring at a face in the mirror he wasn't sure he recognized anymore. If you're watching this with your coffee going cold, or lying in bed with the lights already off, or driving home from a shift with nowhere else you need to be right now, stay with me. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what the weather's like tonight where you are, because this one earns the ending, and I want you here for all of it. Her name was Kdrama Eze. This is the story of a man who signed away a marriage based on a lie he never checked. A mother who spent the last years of her life quietly undoing her son's biggest mistake, and a seat at the head of a family table that was never really about blood in the first place. Jun-ho didn't sleep again that night. He sat on the edge of his bed until the sky outside his window went from black to the flat gray of a Seoul morning, replaying 38 seconds of audio so many times that by the 7th hour, he no longer needed to press play to hear it. It had simply moved into permanent residence somewhere behind his sternum. By 11 the next morning, he was in the back of a black S-Class, heading north out of the city toward his mother's estate in Pyeongchang-dong, and beside him sat the woman he was engaged to marry. Her name was Han Yu-ri, 29 years old, the second daughter of a shipping conglomerate family, educated at Yonsei and then at Columbia, raised from birth to understand that composure was armor and armor was survival. She wore a soft ivory suit that morning, tailored to the exact degree of formality the occasion demanded, and she carried, on her lap, a lacquered box containing a gift for Jun-ho's mother. A rare bottle of 40-year-old ginseng wine her own mother had insisted on, because first impressions with a matriarch, she'd been told since childhood, were not negotiable, were in fact one of the only truly non-negotiable things in a life otherwise full of careful accommodations. Jun-ho had said almost nothing in the car. Yuri assumed it was nerves. The ordinary nerves of a man about to formally present his choice of wife to a mother whose approval mattered more than any courts. It wasn't nerves. It was a man who had spent the entire night listening to 38 seconds of audio on a loop, and who had begun, somewhere around the 20th replay, to understand that everything he'd built on the assumption of one woman's permanent absence was about to be examined by the only person he'd never managed to out-argue, outweight, or outmaneuver in his entire adult life. The gates of the estate opened without a sound, the way they always did, hydraulics maintained to a standard his father had insisted on decades earlier, and no one had ever thought to relax. The driveway curved between 2 long rows of old pines that had been transplanted from the family's ancestral province 40 years before, at a cost no one in the family discussed aloud even now. 2 household staff waited at the entrance in matching dark hanbok and Junho noticed, the way a man in his position notices what's wrong in a room before he notices what's right, that neither of them met his eyes. The senior housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Jang, who had worked for the family since before Junho could walk, who had once scolded him with a wooden spoon for tracking mud across a floor she'd spent all morning polishing, bowed lower than she needed to, and held the door open a beat too long, her hand trembling slightly on the handle. Yuri noticed it too. She filed it away, the way she'd been trained her whole life to file away small wrongnesses in a room, the way her mother had taught her that the seam of a jacket could speak louder than a sentence if you learned to read the room correctly. Inside, the air smelled of doenjang jjigae, which struck Junho immediately as strange, because doenjang jjigae wasn't a dish you served for a formal blessing. It was a family dish, the dish you served to someone who was already inside the house, not someone arriving to be evaluated by it. His mother wasn't waiting in the foyer. His younger sister wasn't either. Instead, 3 of his senior lieutenants stood near the entrance to the formal dining hall, standing the particular way men stand outside a room they're no longer certain they're still allowed into. Shoulders angled slightly away from the doors, weight distributed, like men bracing for a decision that had already been made without them. The double doors were closed. Mrs. Jang, not lifting her eyes, said only, in the soft register of someone instructed to say precisely these words and no others, "Boss, Madam asked that you both go straight in." Junho took Yuri's arm the way a man does when he's stopped trusting the floor beneath him. Mrs. Jang pushed the doors open. The first thing Yuri saw was the table, 12 feet of dark rosewood, polished to a mirror, set with the family's oldest porcelain, exactly the way it had been set for every important gathering for 3 generations. A tradition maintained, down to the placement of individual serving dishes. The second thing she saw was the wall behind it, hung with a large black and white photograph of Junho's grandfather standing in front of the first warehouse the family had ever owned. Taken in a year, none of the living family members could quite remember without checking. The third thing she saw was the woman sitting in the chair at the head of the table. That chair belonged to Madame Seo. Everyone born into this family knew it. Everyone who married into it learned it, before they learned the staff's names, before they learned which cousin controlled which faction, before they learned anything else about how this particular family actually worked beneath its careful surfaces. The woman seated in it was not Madame Seo. She was tall, even sitting down. Her shoulders set the particular way people hold themselves when they've spent years learning how to be looked at without flinching. Her skin was a deep, warm brown, her hair braided close to her scalp, in a pattern that had clearly taken hours to set, each row precise. She wore a charcoal hanbok jacket, cut precisely to her frame, the collar trimmed in a thread the color of unripe persimmon, worn the way a woman wears something she's earned, not the way a woman wears something she's borrowed for an occasion and will return by evening. In front of her sat a single celadon teacup, half full, steam still rising off it in a thin, deliberate line toward the ceiling. Around her neck hung a thin gold chain with a small jade pendant, the kind of small that only mattered because of who had given it and why. Junho knew that pendant. He had watched his mother remove it from her own neck 11 years earlier and place it, with both hands, around the neck of the woman he'd been married to for barely 3 months at the time, in a kitchen that still smelled of doenjang jjigae from the lesson that had just ended. Her name was Chidinma Eze Seo, 38 years old, born in Houston to a Nigerian father and an Igbo-American mother, raised bilingual, trained as a forensic logistics analyst, fluent in the careful, formal Korean of a daughter-in-law who had spent years learning a language nobody in her own family had ever asked her to learn, because she'd decided, early on, that love meant doing the harder thing without being asked. 3 years ago, Jun-ho had signed divorce papers without reading the final clause. He hadn't seen her since that signature. He hadn't let himself think about her more than a handful of times in 3 years, and each time he had, he'd redirected the thought, the way you redirect traffic around a collapsed bridge, quickly, efficiently, without examining the wreckage underneath. He stopped walking. Yuri didn't at first. She took 2 more steps before she registered that her fiancé had frozen behind her, and when she turned to look at him, she saw, for the first time in the 8 months she'd known him, his right hand closed into a fist around nothing at all. The fingers curled tight over an emptiness that had no name yet. From the doorway behind them, Madame Seo entered, 69 years old, small, wearing the deep indigo hanbok she reserved only for ancestral rites and funerals. The fabric so dark, it seemed to absorb the light from the chandelier, rather than reflect it. She carried a lacquered tray with a second celadon cup, steam rising off it the same deliberate way. She crossed the room in the slow, unhurried steps her own mother-in-law had once taught her, decades ago, in this same house, and set the second cup down directly in front of Chidi, not in front of Jun-ho, not in front of Yuri, in front of the woman in her chair. Then she turned, walked back along the table's length, and bowed, 30 degrees, deep and unhurried, to her former daughter-in-law, the household staff watching from the doorway, with expressions carefully arranged into neutrality. The room had been silent before. The silence after that bow was a different silence entirely, and Yuri, who had been raised in rooms exactly like this one her whole life, understood the difference immediately, in her body, before her mind caught up. Somewhere in her chest, she heard a door close that she hadn't known was open, hadn't known existed, until this exact moment revealed both the door and its closing simultaneously. Iomeoni, she said carefully, using the honorific with practiced grace. I think there may be some confusion about the seating. Madame Seo didn't look at her. She looked at her son. Jun-ho, she said, in a voice that never rose, that had never once in Jun-ho's memory needed to rise to command a room's full attention. Sit down. There is something you should have been told 3 years ago, and I am done being the reason you weren't. If your chest is tight right now, take 1 breath and stay with it, because what happens in the next hour in that dining room is going to take everything you think you understand about loyalty and rebuild it into something colder, sharper, and far more honest than what walked through those doors 10 minutes ago. And when it's over, I want to know, in the comments, whether you'd have made the same choice Jun-ho is about to make, faced with everything he's about to learn. To understand what was happening in that dining hall, you have to go back 11 years, to a city that neither of them remembers now the way it actually was, because memory softens what it can't afford to keep sharp. Houston, late July, the kind of heat that softens the asphalt by mid-afternoon and makes the whole city move a half step slower than it thinks it's moving. Jun-ho was 29, sent by his father to oversee a shipping contract the family had spent 2 years quietly trying to secure, a contract that would open a Gulf Coast route the Baco organization had wanted access to for over a decade. He was staying in a corporate serviced apartment near the port, with a view of a parking structure and a highway overpass. Nothing worth photographing, nothing that told him anything about the city he'd been sent to. Chidi was 27, 2 years into a position at a logistics consultancy that specialized in the kind of freight movement most firms preferred not to look at too closely, the kind of quiet, careful work that required someone who could read a bill of lading the way other people read a face. Her father taught organic chemistry at a small Catholic university on the city's east side. Her mother ran a customs brokerage out of a warehouse near the ship channel, the kind of business built on relationships with dock workers and harbor pilots that outlasted any single contract. Chidi had grown up learning to read manifests the way other children learned to read faces, for what was missing, what didn't add up, what someone was trying not to say between the lines of a shipping document. They met across a conference table on a Wednesday, in a meeting neither of them would have described, at the time, as anything more than routine. Junho spoke English with the careful, slightly formal grammar of someone taught by a tutor rather than a city. Every preposition placed with textbook precision and just enough deliberateness that it drew attention to itself. Chidi, with a Houston ear finely tuned to exactly that kind of gap between grammar and rhythm, caught the sound underneath it within 4 sentences. She corrected one of his idioms without thinking twice about it. A small, automatic correction, the kind she made a dozen times a week without anyone noticing. He laughed. It was, he would tell her much later, the first time he'd laughed in 11 days, and he hadn't realized until that exact moment how long it had actually been. They saw each other 7 more times over the following 6 weeks, always framed as business, always somehow extending past the point business required. She showed him a barbecue place near her apartment that had no sign out front and a line that started forming before it opened. He showed her, without meaning to at first, the particular loneliness of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the person everyone else needed something from, and who had never quite worked out what it felt like to simply be wanted for the shape of himself. They married 90 days after that first meeting, at the Harris County Courthouse, 2 witnesses pulled from the hallway, no family present on either side, and a single white chrysanthemum in a paper cone that Chidi had bought that morning from a Vietnamese florist on Bel Air Street, because she'd read, in a book she wouldn't admit for years to having read, that white chrysanthemums meant funerals in Korea, and she'd liked, with a kind of quiet defiance that would come to define most of her important decisions, the idea of beginning their marriage by burying the version of him that had arrived in her city completely alone, replacing it with whatever they were about to become together. For 4 years, she learned. She learned doenjangjige standing over an earthenware pot in Madame Sio's kitchen one long Sunday afternoon in October, taught with hands instead of recipes, 3 hours on her feet without a single written note, because Madame Sio told her, in careful English chosen specifically so there could be no misunderstanding, "You don't learn this from a page, you learn it from a hand, and the hand has to be yours." She learned to bow correctly on her first seolul, kneeling on a cold floor in a pale yellow hanbok that didn't quite fit across the shoulders, and Madame Seo had reached down with both hands and lifted her up before her forehead touched the floor and said, quietly, in a moment neither of them would ever fully explain to anyone else, "Daughter, you are not a guest here. A guest bows to be polite. You will bow because you mean it, and today, you don't have to mean it yet." She learned the language so thoroughly that by the 3rd year, the extended family stopped translating around her at gatherings, stopped switching to English when she entered a room, which she understood, correctly, as the deepest form of acceptance this particular family knew how to offer. She learned the business, too, in the careful, patient way she'd learned everything else in her life. Not because anyone sat her down and taught her, but because she noticed things, the way she'd been trained to notice things her entire professional life. She noticed which shipments moved through which ports, at which hours, and which ones didn't quite match the paperwork that accompanied them. She noticed a man named Choi Dae-sung, the syndicate's longtime chief strategist and her father-in-law's former right hand, a man who had been managing the family's operational affairs since before Jun-ho was born, who addressed her with scrupulously correct honorifics and a tone that never quite matched them, a courtesy that felt, every time, like a blade being sheathed rather than put away. She protected the family without ever announcing that she was doing it, the same way her mother had run the Houston warehouse, by knowing, quietly, where every shipment was at every hour, by knowing which dock workers had sick children and which had gambling debts, by knowing which numbers got called at 3 in the morning and which never got called at all. It was a kind of vigilance nobody in the family had asked her to maintain, and one she maintained anyway, because it was the only language of loyalty she fully trusted. In the autumn of her 4th year of marriage, she uncovered, buried inside 18 months of shipping ledgers she'd cross-referenced, almost as a personal exercise on a slow week, a pattern of underreported freight values routed through 3 shell accounts registered in Busan, all of them traceable, with enough patience and the right cross-referencing, back to accounts Choi Dae-sung personally controlled through 2 layers of nominee ownership. Nearly 2 billion won, skimmed slowly enough across 4 years that no single transaction, viewed in isolation, would ever have looked wrong to anyone not looking for the pattern specifically. She didn't take it to Jun-ho first. She'd learned, over 4 years of marriage, that her husband preferred conclusions over process, that he wanted the ending of a story, not the careful accumulation of evidence that built toward it. She took the folder instead to Madame Seo, sealed, on a Tuesday afternoon in her mother-in-law's private study, and asked her what she thought should be done, understanding even as she asked that she was handing her mother-in-law something that could reshape the entire balance of power inside the organization. Madame Seo told her to wait 1 week while she quietly verified the numbers herself, through channels of her own that had nothing to do with her son's operational structure. Chidi agreed. What neither of them accounted for was that Choi Dae-sung's network inside the household, built over 3 decades of careful cultivation, favors extended and called in, staff members quietly indebted to him in ways no one else had bothered to track, ran deeper than either woman had estimated. He learned of the folder within 3 days of its creation. He moved before either of them could. The photographs arrived at Jun-ho's private office above the Incheon warehouse 2 weeks later, in a plain envelope with no return address, delivered by a courier who couldn't later be traced to any legitimate service. They showed Chidi in a hotel lobby in Singapore, seated across from a man whose face was angled just enough away from the camera to remain permanently unidentifiable, captioned in an accompanying typed page, as a courier for a rival organization. Jun-ho had spent the previous year fighting for control of a Gulf-facing shipping lane, the very organization the original Houston contract, years earlier, had been meant to keep at bay. Attached to the photographs was a forged bank statement showing a wire transfer of 200 million won into an account under Chidi's maiden name, dated 3 weeks earlier, and a single typed line at the bottom of the page that Jun-ho would read more times over the following 3 years than he'd ever admit to anyone. She has been theirs since before the wedding. Jun-ho did not ask her. This was the failure, not the divorce itself, not even the speed of it, but the 11 days before it, in which he never once sat across from his wife and asked her, directly, to explain what he was looking at. Asking would have required entertaining, even briefly, The possibility that he'd built 4 years of certainty on a foundation someone else had quietly poured, and he had never learned, in 33 years of being groomed to lead an organization that ran on absolute conviction, how to hold that kind of doubt without it feeling like a fatal weakness. He gave the folder to his lawyer on a Monday. He signed the divorce papers on a Friday, in a room by himself, with no one present to ask him a single question he might not have had a ready answer for. He didn't read the final clause, inserted quietly by Chidi's own attorney at her instruction, which redirected her full settlement into a scholarship foundation established in Madame Sio's name, a detail he wouldn't discover for 3 more years, and one that would, when he finally did discover it, undo something in him that had been holding steady, purely out of habit. He had her belongings removed from their Hanam-dong apartment while she was at a medical appointment she'd mentioned to him only in passing, a routine follow-up she hadn't wanted to make a production of. When she came home that evening, there was a single suitcase in the entryway and a sealed envelope on the console table containing a note in his handwriting, 4 words long, words she would not repeat aloud to anyone for 11 years. She read it once. She put the note back in the envelope. She picked up the suitcase. She did not cry in the hallway. She did not cry in the elevator. She did not cry in the taxi to Incheon Airport, though the driver would later tell his wife that the woman in the back seat had the particular stillness of someone holding something very heavy without letting it show in her hands. What Jun-ho never knew, what nobody in that dining hall 3 years later knew except Madame Seo and Chidi herself, was that Chidi had gone to that medical appointment because she was 7 weeks pregnant, a fact she had been planning to tell him that same week, and that she miscarried alone in a Houston apartment 4 months later, 3 weeks after landing back in the city she'd grown up in, with no family member aware she'd even been pregnant in the first place, because by then, telling anyone would have meant explaining everything else first, and she hadn't yet found the words for any of it. She didn't tell her own mother. She told no one, for almost 2 years, except the one person who eventually reached out to her first, unprompted, unasked. Madame Seo called her 11 months after the divorce, using a private mobile number her son didn't know existed, kept in a drawer beside her bed for exactly this kind of contact, and asked one question, without preamble. "Daughter, did you do what they said you did?" Chidi told her the truth, in full, for the first time to anyone. Madame Seo believed her instantly, not because of any new evidence presented in that moment, but because she'd spent 4 years watching this woman move through her household with a precision and care that never once matched the story Choi Dae-sung had sold her son in a folder of photographs. She apologized, at length, for a silence she hadn't broken sooner, and then she told Chidi something she hadn't yet told her own son, that she'd been diagnosed, 6 months earlier, with a slow-moving but serious form of ovarian cancer, and that she had decided, somewhere in the disorienting fog of that diagnosis, that she was not willing to die, with her son still poisoned by a lie she had the power to disprove, and had simply, out of exhaustion and uncertainty, not yet acted on. For the next 2 years they spoke twice a month, on the 11th and the 23rd, a schedule only the 2 of them kept, calls that ran anywhere from 20 minutes to over an hour, conversations that ranged from the mundane, recipes, weather, a cousin's wedding, to the excruciating, circling slowly back, again and again, to the folder of photographs and everything it had cost both of them. Madame Seo funded, quietly and entirely without her son's knowledge, an independent forensic audit of the original wire transfer evidence, hiring an accountant with no prior ties to the family or the organization, paid through an account that led back to nothing traceable. It took the accountant 14 months, working carefully and in the margins of other work to avoid drawing attention, to trace the forgery conclusively back to a technician on Choi Dae-sung's personal payroll, a young man in Busan who had been paid, the records eventually showed, 47 million won for a single afternoon's work, altering a set of wire confirmation records. Madame Seo sat on that proof for another 8 months after receiving it, waiting, not out of hesitation and not out of fear, but because she understood something Choi Dae-sung had spent 35 years failing to account for in anyone but himself, that she had outlasted worse men than him through patience alone, buried a husband and watched 3 brothers-in-law die in circumstances the family never discussed openly, and she intended to spend whatever silence she had left doing exactly what she'd always done, waiting for the moment that would do the most good instead of just the most damage. That moment arrived the week her son announced his engagement to Han Yu-ri. Back in the dining hall, 2 hours after Madame Seo set the second cup down in front of Chidi, after Yu-ri had removed her hand from her clutch and put it back twice, after the household staff had brought in bowls of stew that no one touched and quietly carried away again, after 3 cousins had excused themselves from the room with murmured apologies and 3 others had entered without being asked, Junho stood and asked Chidi, in English, if she would walk with him to the garden room. She finished her tea before she answered. The garden room was a small glassed conservatory at the rear of the estate, looking out over a strip of lawn toward the western wall, a room that had been added by Junho's grandmother decades earlier, and used, in the family's private mythology, as the place where difficult conversations happened, because no one could raise their voice inside glass without the whole garden hearing it. A single rattan bench sat against the far wall. A kerosene heater in the corner sat unlit, unnecessary against the mild autumn air. She sat on the bench. He stood at the glass, his back to her, for almost 2 full minutes before he turned around, and when he did, she was already looking at him, had been looking at him, he understood, for the entire 2 minutes. "You came," he said. "Your mother asked me. I came for her. The memo," he said. "The voice message. Last night. I sent it," she said. "She isn't dying this year. Not urgently. Not in the way the message implied. But she wanted you in that room today. And she asked me how to make sure you'd actually come. Because she knows you, Junho, possibly better than either of us gives her credit for. And I told her to make it sound like an emergency. Because I know you too, and you don't come running for the truth. You only ever came running for a crisis." He absorbed that in silence, standing very still. His hand went to the watch on his wrist and stayed there, thumb pressing against the crystal the way it always did when he needed something to hold on to that wasn't a person. "I'm going to speak now," she said, her voice level, rehearsed in the particular way of someone who had run through this conversation alone, many times, in the quiet of her own apartment, long before this morning ever arrived. "You won't interrupt. When I'm finished, you can decide what to do with what I've said. There are 3 things you need to hear, and I am only going to say them once." He nodded once. 1. I never betrayed you. Not once. Not in any form. Not for any amount of money. The man in those photographs was a colleague from a logistics conference in Singapore. A married man, incidentally, with 3 children, who I have not spoken to in over 5 years, and who has no idea his face was ever used this way. The wire transfer was forged by a technician on Choi Dae-sung's personal payroll, a young man in Busan, your mother's independent accountant, identified 14 months into an audit she funded entirely on her own, without your knowledge, because she suspected the truth before either of us could prove it. I found the embezzlement he was hiding inside our own shipping ledgers. He found out I'd found it first, and he moved before I could bring it to you properly. He didn't speak. His face had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man doing rapid, silent arithmetic on 4 years of certainty and watching the sum come out wrong. 2. I was pregnant when you had my things removed from the apartment. 7 weeks along, I was planning to tell you that same week. I lost the baby 4 months later, alone, in a rented apartment in Houston, because by then there was no one left in my life on this continent who even knew to check on me, and I hadn't found the words yet to explain to my own mother everything that had happened in between. I named her. I'm not going to tell you the name today. That decision is still mine, and it may stay mine for as long as I decide it should. His hand left the watch. It went instead to the glass of the conservatory and rested there, palm flat against the cool surface. And for the first time since she'd walked back into his life that morning, she watched something in him actually break, quietly, without a sound, without a single dramatic gesture, just a slow settling of his shoulders that told her more than any tears could have. 3. I don't want your money. I don't want your name back. I don't want that seat at the table you saw me sitting in. Your mother put me there today to make a point to this entire family, not because I asked for it, or because I intend to keep it. I am not here to be your wife again, Junho. I came because Madame Seo asked me, and because the woman about to marry you deserved to know the truth about the man she was marrying before she signed her own life over to a story that was never fully true. That's what I owe her, and it's the only thing I came here to give. After today, you don't see me again, unless I choose it. If you ever want to, you write a letter. You send it to the address your mother keeps. You wait. I answer when I answer, if I answer at all. Those are the conditions, he said, after a long silence, his voice rougher than she'd heard it in 11 years. Those are the conditions. Chidi, I am so sorry. I know, she said, and something in her own composure wavered for just a fraction of a second before she steadied it again. That wasn't one of the conditions. I already knew that part, Junho. I've known it for 3 years. Knowing it was never the hard part. He didn't cry. He didn't sit down, though the bench was close enough that sitting would have felt natural. He stood at the glass, let his forehead rest against it for exactly 1 second, then straightened his spine and bowed to her. Deep, 45 degrees, the bow of a man delivering an apology he knows cannot be fully accepted, offered anyway, because withholding it would have been its own kind of cowardice. She didn't bow back. She didn't need to. She stood, walked past him without another word, opened the door of the conservatory, and returned to the dining hall, where her tea was still faintly warm on the table. He returned 11 minutes later, and the room had changed in his absence in ways that took him several seconds to fully register. Yuri was no longer seated at the table. She stood at the far window, her clutch resting on the sill, her ivory jacket still buttoned to the throat, watching him approach with the clear, dry-eyed expression of a woman who had finished, in the last hour, every calculation she was ever going to make about this particular marriage. Madame Seo sat now in the chair at the head of the table, because Chidi had quietly moved 1 seat to the right the moment her former mother-in-law returned to the room, a small physical gesture that nonetheless rearranged the entire visible hierarchy of the household in a single motion. Choi Dae-sung remained 3 seats down, a glass of untouched hwyo in front of him, his face carefully arranged into something between concern and mild confusion. A man who had survived 35 years inside this organization, largely by knowing exactly which expression a room required and producing it on command. Jun-ho did not sit. He walked instead to the foot of the table, the position reserved. By an old custom nobody had formally written down, but everyone understood. For a man about to say something, the family would be repeating for years afterward. Choi Dae-sung-si, he said. Not Hyung-nim, not even the more distant, but still respectful honorific, reserved for senior colleagues who had earned decades of deference. The bare form used, traditionally, for outsiders and strangers. The room registered the shift, the way a body registers a fracture before the pain fully arrives. A collective, silent intake of breath around the long rosewood table. 4 years ago, you handed me an envelope in my office above the Incheon warehouse. 3 photographs, a forged bank statement, and 1 typed line designed to end a marriage in under 2 weeks. I want you to tell this room who paid the technician who forged that wire transfer. I want you to tell this room what my wife found buried in your accounts 18 months into that same year, and whether the timing of that envelope had anything whatsoever to do with what she'd found. Choi Dae-sung set his glass down carefully, without drinking from it. This isn't the appropriate setting for. I have the forensic report, Jun-ho continued, as though the older man hadn't spoken at all, his voice never once rising above the level it had held since he entered the room. 14 months of independent work, commissioned by my mother, without my knowledge, sitting in a folder in her study right now. I have a signed statement from the technician. You paid 47 million won to alter the wire records. I have the original hotel registration logs from Singapore, showing the man in those photographs was exactly who my wife said he was 3 years ago, when I never once bothered to ask her. I am going to ask you one question, Dae-sung-si, and your answer to it will determine whether you leave this house tonight on your own feet or in the custody of someone considerably less patient than I am. Did you embezzle from the Yoksam accounts, and did you frame my wife to keep her from reporting what she'd found? Choi Dae-sung looked, for the first time since the confrontation began, toward Madame Seo. She looked back at him with no expression at all, the particular blankness of a woman who had already made every decision she intended to make about this moment years earlier, and was simply waiting, now, for the rest of the room to catch up to her. Answer him, she said, in the same voice she'd used decades earlier to call her son in from the garden when he was 9 years old and had wandered too close to the estate's outer wall. The silence stretched long enough that at least 3 people at the table stopped breathing audibly. The only sound in the room the faint hiss of the unlit kerosene heater in the far conservatory, still visible through the open door. Then Choi Dae-sung said, quietly, in a voice that seemed to have aged a decade in the space of the last 5 minutes. Yes. The room exhaled, a collective, involuntary sound. Jun-ho did not. You will sign tonight, before you leave this house, an instrument transferring your interests in the Yoksam Holdings and the Busan port contracts back to the organization in full. You will resign every position you hold, effective by Friday, in writing, delivered to the family's legal counsel. You will never again be in any room my mother occupies, for any reason, for as long as either of you lives. If you contest any part of this in any court of the Republic, the full forensic file, the wire confirmations, the hospital logs, the technician's signed statement, all of it, goes directly to the Supreme Prosecutor's office by the end of that same week. Do you understand the terms as I've stated them? Choi Dae-sung nodded once, a small, defeated motion, and rose from his seat without another word, leaving his glass of hwayo untouched on the rosewood table behind him. He left the room and the house within the hour, and would not be seen by anyone at that table again. Jun-ho turned to Yuri, who hadn't moved from her position at the window throughout the entire exchange. He crossed the room and bowed to her, deep, 45 degrees, the same bow he'd offered Chidi in the conservatory minutes earlier, though this one carried a different weight entirely. Yuri-si, he said, in Korean, his voice steady now in a way it hadn't been all morning. I have wronged you today by bringing you into a story I hadn't finished telling even myself, let alone you. I will speak to your father this evening, in person, and take full responsibility for everything that's happened. The engagement is over. The fault is entirely mine, and I will say so to anyone who asks, in any room, for as long as it needs to be said. Yuri looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the way she'd spent a lifetime perfecting. Then she crossed the room, set the lacquered box containing her mother's ginseng wine down on the table in front of Madame Seo instead of him, bowed correctly and completely to the matriarch, and walked out of the dining hall without another word to anyone present. She didn't cry in the car. Her driver would report weeks later to no one in particular that she had said only one sentence on the entire drive back to Hanam-dong: take the long way. She didn't specify the long way to what. He drove along the river instead of the highway. She watched the water the entire time, and by the time the car reached her father's compound, she had already, in the careful, methodical way she'd been raised to handle every setback life presented her, begun designing the next chapter of her life without anyone else's name attached to any part of it. 6 months later, Yuri would be photographed at the opening of her own independent investment fund, a project her father had quietly discouraged for over a year, and she had built anyway, largely on the strength of relationships she'd cultivated entirely outside the world she'd nearly married into. When a reporter asked, gently, whether the failed engagement had been difficult to move past, she said only, "It taught me the difference between a partnership and a performance. I'm not particularly interested in performances anymore." She never spoke publicly about that afternoon in Pyeongchang-dong again, and she never needed to. She had already, without ever once raising her voice or making a public scene, become the person in this story who best demonstrated what walking away with your dignity fully intact actually looks like in practice, rather than in theory. Jun-ho went to the small apartment in Mapo 11 days after that afternoon, carrying nothing, because he'd learned, quietly, from a conversation with his mother, that showing up with gifts would only make him look like a man trying to purchase back something that had never once been for sale. Chidi's elderly neighbor, an 81-year-old woman named Mrs. No, who lived 2 doors down and had appointed herself an unofficial gatekeeper, answered the door instead of Chidi, took one long look at him, and closed it without a single word. He came again 23 days later. Chidi opened the door herself this time. She didn't invite him in. "You can stand there," she said, gesturing to the narrow entryway. "You don't get to come further than that yet. Maybe not for a long time." They spoke for 9 minutes, about nothing of any real consequence. The weather, a construction project down the street, a delivery mix-up at her building. At the end of those 9 minutes, she said, "There's a school event on Saturday. A child I mentor through a community program is competing in a debate tournament in Yungpyeong. You can come and sit in the back row if you want to. You don't speak to him. You don't introduce yourself. You leave the moment he leaves. If you can manage those 3 things without deviation, you can come again the following Saturday. He managed it. That Saturday, and everyone after it for the next month. Always in the back row, always silent, always leaving the instant the event ended. On the 4th Saturday, after the tournament had concluded, Chidi finally introduced them properly in the small kitchen of her Mapo apartment, where the boy sat at the table, working through a mathematics problem with a pencil sharpened down to half its original length. The boy's name was Daniel Chinedu Seo. He was 8 years old. He had been born in Houston, 8 months and 12 days after the divorce papers were finalized, a fact Chidi had not known when she boarded her flight out of Incheon that final night, and had only discovered 6 weeks later, alone, sitting in a clinic waiting room in Houston, staring at a result she hadn't planned for and hadn't wanted to face without someone in her life who actually fully knew her. She hadn't told anyone about him for nearly 2 years. She told Madame Seo only when her former mother-in-law asked her directly, during one of their twice-monthly calls, in a tone that suggested she'd already half-suspected the answer. "Daughter, is there a child?" "Yes," Chidi had said, after a long pause on the line. Madame Seo had wept for exactly 1 measured minute. Chidi had counted, sitting with the phone pressed to her ear, listening to a grief she recognized in her own chest, reflected back at her, and then stopped, deliberately, and said, "His father will not know until you decide, on your own timeline, that he's ready to." Junho met his son properly on that 4th Saturday afternoon, kneeling on the cracked linoleum of a kitchen floor that had been laid down sometime in the mid-90s, in a suit that cost considerably more than the apartment's monthly rent, while an 8-year-old boy looked up from his math workbook and asked, in flawless, effortlessly bilingual Korean and English, "Are you the man my mom used to be married to?" "I am," Junho said, his voice catching slightly on the second word. "My mom says you make mistakes, but you're not a bad man. Is that true?" "I would like it to be true," Junho said. "I'm going to try to make it true, if you'll let me try." The boy considered this answer with the particular gravity only children fully possess, weighing it the way he might weigh a difficult problem in his workbook, nodded once, and returned to his homework without further comment. Chidi, standing at the counter with her back to both of them, peeled a pear with slow, deliberate strokes, and did not offer either of them a slice, though the smell of it filled the small kitchen for the rest of the afternoon. The following months moved slowly, deliberately, entirely on Chidi's terms. Junho sent 1 message a week, always a single question, never more. What's Daniel's favorite subject? Does he like music? Is he afraid of anything in particular? Chidi answered each one briefly, sometimes with a photograph of a drawing or a school project, never with a photograph of the boy's face, and Junho understood the distinction without needing it explained to him. Faces were the last gift. He hadn't earned them yet, and he stopped expecting to earn them quickly. He restructured, over those same months, significant portions of the Baeko organization's holdings, divesting entirely from 3 ventures Choi Dae-sung had championed over decades, operations that had drifted, gradually and without any single dramatic moment, into legally gray territory his father had once tolerated and his mother had always privately opposed. He replaced them with 2 fully legitimate holdings, a mid-sized shipping logistics firm and a small publishing house that had been struggling under previous ownership. The profits from these new ventures were smaller, considerably smaller than what the organization had grown accustomed to under his father's leadership. He found, to his own quiet surprise, that he slept better regardless. He did not tell Chidi about any of these changes directly. She noticed anyway, through the careful channels she still maintained, old contacts in logistics and shipping, who mentioned, in passing conversations, that the Baco name was appearing in different kinds of paperwork than it used to. She never mentioned it to him. She simply continued answering his weekly messages, one question at a time, watching from a careful distance, as the man who had once signed away her entire life, without reading the final clause, began, slowly, and without any apparent audience, to become someone considerably more deserving of the son they shared. Madame Sio's illness, meanwhile, did not remain hidden much longer. 6 months after the confrontation in the dining hall, she told her son directly, not through Chidi, not through a letter, but in person, seated across from him, in her private study, the same room where she'd once verified the forensic evidence that would eventually unmake Choi Dae-sung. She told him about the diagnosis, the treatment she'd been quietly undergoing under an assumed name in a Singapore hospital for over a year, and the 2 years of secret correspondence with Chidi that had brought them all to this point. Jun-ho did not respond with anger, though he understood, later, that he might reasonably have been entitled to some. He understood, sitting in that study, that his mother's silence had never been about excluding him. It had been about waiting for the exact moment when the truth would do the most good, rather than simply the most immediate damage. The same patient calculation, he realized, that had defined nearly every decision she'd made across 70 years of surviving inside a violent and unforgiving world. "You could have told me sooner," he said, not as an accusation, simply as an observation. "I could have," Madame Sio agreed. "I chose not to, because you were not yet a man capable of hearing it without breaking something important in the process. I had to wait for you to become someone who could hold difficult truths without needing to destroy the person delivering them. I am sorry it took this long. I am not sorry I waited." He accepted this, eventually, the way he'd learned to accept most of his mother's decisions. Not immediately, but fully, once he'd had time to sit with the reasoning behind them. The months that followed brought a slow, deliberate rebuilding on every front. Choi Dae-sung's departure created a vacuum inside the organization's operational structure that Jun-ho filled carefully, promoting younger, less compromised lieutenants who had no personal history tangled up in the events of the previous 4 years. The organization itself began, gradually, to resemble something closer to a legitimate conglomerate than the operation his father and grandfather had built. A transformation that some of the older family members resisted quietly, and others embraced with visible relief, exhausted after decades of operating in the margins of the law. Yuri's investment fund, meanwhile, grew steadily over that first year, built entirely on relationships and capital that had nothing to do with the Baco name or the engagement that had briefly connected her to it. She and Jun-ho spoke exactly once more, several months after the dining hall confrontation, a brief, businesslike phone call in which she confirmed the formal dissolution of the engagement contract, and he confirmed, in turn, that her family would face no complications or lingering obligations as a result of what had happened. Neither of them raised their voice. Neither of them needed to. It was, in its own quiet way, the most honest conversation either of them had had with the other during the entire 8 months they'd known each other. Chidi allowed Jun-ho past the entryway of her Mapo apartment for the first time nearly a year after that initial visit, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, for what she described only as dinner, nothing more, and you leave when I say it's time. He came without gifts, as he had every time before, and sat at the same small kitchen table where he'd first met his son, now considerably more comfortable in that space than he'd been on his first visit. Daniel showed him a drawing before they'd even finished setting the table. 4 figures holding hands, one noticeably taller than the others, sketched in the careful, slightly uneven lines of a 9-year-old still developing his sense of proportion. "This is really good," Junho said, studying it carefully. "Can I keep it?" "You can borrow it," Daniel said, with the precise correction of a child who had clearly given the matter some thought. "But you have to bring it back next time. I want to add Grandma Sio to it. There's not enough room yet." Chidi, at the stove, made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough to go unnoticed. It was, Junho realized in that moment, the first time he'd heard anything close to genuine laughter from her in over a decade, and he had to look down at the drawing in his hands to keep his own composure intact, understanding clearly that this moment, whatever else it was not about him, and breaking down in the middle of it would have made it so. After Daniel went to bed, Chidi sat with him briefly in the small living room, the first time she'd allowed that particular kind of proximity since everything had begun unraveling, and then, slowly, rebuilding itself. "I am not going to marry you again," she said, without preamble, the sentence delivered with the same clarity she brought to everything important. "I want that stated clearly, so there's no confusion later." "I understand," he said, "but I am going to let you be present, fully present, as his father, and as some kind of person in my own life, in whatever shape that eventually takes, with absolutely no promises attached to any of it, beyond what we figure out 1 week at a time. Whatever you decide," Junho said, "will be more than I have any right to expect, and I intend to keep earning it, regardless of how much or how little you eventually offer." She studied him for a long moment in the dim light of the living room lamp. "You've changed," she said finally, quietly. "Not because you told me you would, because I've watched you actually do it, for almost a full year now, without an audience, without anyone keeping score but the two of us." Madame Seo lived for 2 more years after that dining hall confrontation, considerably longer than her initial diagnosis had suggested might be possible, a fact her doctors attributed partly to treatment, and partly, though they wouldn't say so officially, to something less measurable. A woman who had finally set down a burden she'd been carrying in silence for years, and found, in the lightness that followed, an unexpected reserve of strength. She passed away eventually at Asan Medical Center, in a private room on the 14th floor with a clear view of the river, her son on one side of the bed, and Chidi on the other, exactly as she had once specified she wanted, months earlier, in a conversation neither of them had wanted to have, but both had understood was necessary. She had spent the majority of those final 2 years in remission, long enough to see the audit against Choi Dae-sung close permanently, with the former strategist quietly relocated to a small property in Gangwon Province, where he lived out the remainder of his years without ever again setting foot near the family he'd spent 35 years serving, and, eventually, betraying. Long enough to see her son restructure the organization's holdings into something she could, for the first time in her adult life, describe to outsiders, without carefully editing the description first. Long enough to hold her grandson's hand at a family gathering the year before she died, and call him, in front of the assembled extended family, her true heir, a declaration that surprised no one in that room, least of all Daniel himself, who had, by then, grown thoroughly accustomed to being loved without condition by every adult who mattered to him. 2 weeks before she died, in a small private ceremony attended by exactly 4 people: her son, Chidi, Daniel, and Mrs. Jang, the household's senior housekeeper who had served the family for over 4 decades. Madame Seo formally declined to pass the matriarch's seat to anyone at all, a break from over a century of tradition that scandalized precisely the segments of the extended family she had, by that point in her life, entirely run out of patience for. Instead, seated upright in a wheelchair positioned at the head of the rosewood table for what all 4 people present understood would be one of her final visits to that room, she declared that the chair would remain formally empty until the family could agree, honestly and without the old assumptions about bloodline, on who had actually earned it through something other than birth order and inherited obligation. Chidi and Junho never remarried. That particular door, she had made clear early in their slow rebuilding, was closed permanently, and she never once wavered from that position, even as other aspects of their relationship softened and deepened over time. But roughly 18 months after that afternoon in the dining hall, she allowed him, gradually, entirely on terms she continued to set and adjust as needed, with no promises extracted from her in either direction, back into something resembling a genuinely shared life, not as her husband, but as Daniel's father, in the fullest sense of the word, showing up consistently and unglamorously for parent-teacher conferences and birthday parties and ordinary Tuesday dinners that had no occasion attached to them at all, until showing up simply became who he was in Daniel's life, rather than something he was still visibly working to prove. A year after Madame Seo's death, on the anniversary, a photograph was taken in the small private chapel Asan Medical Center, kept for families of long-term patients. 3 people in the frame: Chidi, in a simple charcoal dress, with the jade pendant still resting at her throat, exactly as it had 11 years earlier. Daniel in a school blazer folded with more care than a 10-year-old typically bothers with, and between the 2 of them, positioned deliberately, an empty rosewood chair that had been brought specially from the Pyeongchang-dong estate for the occasion, because Chidi had insisted, quietly but firmly, that the photograph would not be complete without it. Junho took the photograph himself. He isn't in the frame. On the back, in Chidi's handwriting, in 3 languages arranged carefully across the small white border, is written a single line: "We are family. Anyibu ezinulo." Some men inherit an empire and mistake the inheritance itself for a life fully lived. Some women lose nearly everything a carefully constructed lie can take from them and build something quieter, harder, and considerably more honest in its place, brick by careful brick, with no guarantee anyone will ever come looking to find it. And when the empire finally does come looking, when it finally walks back through the gate it once locked her out of, it learns, in the particular silence of a dining hall built for 14 and occupied that afternoon by considerably fewer people who actually belonged there, that the seat at the head of the table was never really about blood in the first place. It was about who stayed, who kept showing up long after showing up stopped being convenient, and who was still standing there, quietly, when everyone else had long since given up and gone home. If you were Chidi, would you have walked back through that gate the afternoon Madame Seo asked you to? Or would you have let the whole empire simply collapse on the man who built half his life around a mistake he never once thought to question? Tell me, in 1 sentence, exactly where you land on that question, in the comments below. And if this one got you, if you felt that garden room scene, if you're still thinking about a jade pendant and a slip of paper folded inside it, subscribe, ring the bell, and I'll be in the next room with the next story before the week is out.